Part 3. The Demons. Chapter 1. Rob began to regain consciousness slowly while the hot sun beat down on him from overhead. He peeled back his eyelids carefully. They were sticking to his eyeballs. Pain from the bright daylight shot through his head. He squeezed his eyes shut again. His head was throbbing. He then became aware of the rest of his body. All of him was throbbing and aching. He opened his eyes again, but that time they were more ready for the sun. He was curled up on his right side in a fetal position, next to the burned-out but still smoking firewood. Dirt was crusted and caked all over him. He was disorientated. He didn't know where he was for a moment. Then the night before and all the events that led up to it came flooding back to him. It had to only be the next day. The firewood couldn't still be smoldering if it had been any longer than that. What had happened to him? The last thing he could remember was sitting at the fire performing the ritual. The last thing he did was begin to recite the incantation. That wasn't true. There was a thin veil of memory just beyond that event. It was delicate and transparent. He could see through it until it faded away, completely frayed at the edges. He had drunk the liquid. What had happened after that? The stars. He recalled how bright and almost colorful they were. They had sparkled, almost as bright as the blazing fireball that was then making his flesh feel as if it were also smoldering. He remembered something else and bolted up onto his hands and knees. His head spun and he felt as if he were at sea on a tiny schooner in a heavy storm. His elbows wobbled. He sat down and rested his hands on his knees. The ground was burning and digging into his ass cheeks and feet, but he did not care. He looked down at himself. He was filthy. With his right hand he rubbed the dried, flaking dirt off his left arm. He then did the same to his right arm. With both hands he rubbed some of the clumped dirt off of his chest. The bulk came off, but his skin was still blackened with a fine layer of earth. The feeling that had made him jolt at first was starting to creep back in more slowly. Something had happened. He had levitated. He was sure of it. His body had gone through something so extreme, some state of paralysis, and in that state he had been very aware that he was floating. He had only been a few inches off the ground, sitting Indian style in the air with nothing between his crossed feet and the ground but the air. He had felt something go through him. It coursed through him so hard from the ground that it pushed his whole body upward while he was frozen in that involuntary sitting position. The energy had felt like an entire river was pushing into him from the ground and rushing out the back of his head, while his head was forced into his lap. It had felt awful. It had been too much, and that was truly the last thing he remembered before waking and breaking the dirt off his lids by opening his dusty eyes. He had felt so helpless and at the mercy of whatever was trying to take him over. It had been terrifying. He thought he was going to die and spend the rest of eternity with whatever that ferocious force was that had corrupted his body and abused it. He had been pushed to the limit, but he had not been destroyed. He felt as weak as a kitten, but he had survived somehow. A terrible stench hit his waking nostrils. His ears picked up on the buzzing of flies. He turned his head to look behind him. The ground was darkened all around him. He very carefully stood up, trying to humor his lightheadedness. He stepped away from the drying puddle. The flies stirred and settled again. The smell followed him. It was on him. It was all over him. His crotch was covered with the same substance. It was shit. His groin area and his legs were covered in a dried splatter of his own shit. His bowels had released, and from the look of it they had been utterly drained. He didn't even think he had eaten that much in the last few days combined. He remembered that was one of the side effects. That somehow eased his mind a little. He considered whether or not he felt hungry or thirsty at all. There were munchies in the suitcase, and plenty of water still in the tall bottle. He wasn't hungry or thirsty at all, at least not yet. The idea of eating or drinking made him feel ill, so he dismissed it. He would replenish himself later at some point. He began to wonder if he could get an infection from being covered in his own fecal matter. He rubbed the dirt off his oily left palm to look at his cut. He couldn't find where it was. He rubbed off more dirt to get a better look. Surely it was packed with the dirt and needed cleaning out. He spit into his palm and rubbed harder until the filth was completely gone from the lines in his hand. He had made a thorough clean spot. There was no cut there. Maybe he had cut his other hand and forgotten. That was weird to him since he was right-handed, but in his state, and the state he had been in, he figured it was possible. He spit-cleaned his right hand. No cut was there. He furrowed his brow. "This can't be," he said aloud with a disbelieving smile on his face. He looked down at the suture strips on his shoulder. He rubbed the dirt off of them and began to pick at them with his fingertips. They were really stuck on there. He picked and picked until finally he got the edge of one to curl slightly. He grabbed the curl and pulled. His shoulder skin pulled up with it, but released eventually. Soon he had all of the little strips off. They seesawed their way to the ground as he dropped them. He spit into his palm again and began to clean his shoulder. There was no wound anymore. There was not even the hint that one had been there. "Out-fucking-rageous," he said as he laughed deliriously. An idea struck him. He began to spit clean his left kneecap. He had always had an ugly scar on it from falling off his bike when he was a little kid. He always hated it. He would never wear shorts because of it. He got the bare skin exposed. The scar was still there. "Well, that sucks," he said to himself as he shrugged. He looked again at his hand and shoulder in wonder. He marveled at the possibility. There really was something to all of it. Something was happening to him, something wonderful. He felt positively euphoric. The sensation was starting to take a toll, though. He felt like he had to sit down again. He was still lightheaded, and his vision was starting to swim. His heart was pounding in his chest like a tom drum. It was beating so hard he thought he could almost hear it using his ribcage as a percussion instrument. He sat back down on the dirt. He looked at his suitcase. His clothes were waiting for him, but he didn't feel like getting dressed yet. He wanted to study his body for more changes. Being naked out in nature also just felt right to him, even if a cotton shirt would help keep the sun from beating down on him so heavily. It was worth it. Also, there was the fact that he was covered in his own drying shit. Maybe he could find a stream, or at least a puddle, before utterly ruining one of the few outfits he had brought with him. He hoped that he would get to keep his luxurious solitude for a while longer, until after he'd had a chance to clean up. He certainly didn't want a park ranger or even a camper to come along and spot him in his naked except for the crusted dirt all over his body state. Someone might just snag a snapshot of him, and it could end up on YouTube before virally spreading to the rest of the internet. No one would interview him to find out what the actual story was. They would just be content to make up their own as they left comments and blogs about the cleanly nudist fail freak. Looking the way he did, he might even be mistaken for the missing link. He wondered just how far from the truth that might be. He took some deep and steady breaths to try to slow his heart rate. It might be impossible to get to that pumping muscle from the outside, but it might just burst itself into a million pieces right there inside his chest. That would be one hell of a worthless side effect. The slow breathing did not make his chest, which was starting to feel bruised from where his heart was repetitively slamming into it, feel any better, but it was doing something for the lightheadedness. He was beginning to feel like he was actually on solid ground instead of out in the stormy sea. He examined his arms again. Something about them was different. It was subtle, but he knew his body. It was the skin. It was puffy. He pressed his fingers into his forearms. They felt spongy, like they were made out of rubber. He pinched the skin. He could barely feel it. It wasn't so much puffy as it was thick. The skin had thickened. It wasn't just that way on his arms. It was like that all over. He was thicker. That slight change, that no one else would probably even notice, didn't fill him with a feeling of fear. It was another feeling of exhilaration. He was only excited by the prospect of the change, rather than grieving the loss of his previous state of existence. That made him feel like he should be worried about his psychological condition. But he wasn't. He considered that he should have liked himself enough before to be remorseful of losing his former self. After all, there was no going back from what he did. He knew that when he went into it. He had tried not to be, but he had been terrified. Where had that feeling gone? Maybe he was staring down that gift horse's throat again. Couldn't it just be that it had all gone very well and surpassed his level of expectation, and that for once he didn't have to be a skinny little neurotic mess? And couldn't it be possible that he could savor the fruits of his reward for a job well done, instead of overanalyzing the potential consequences, thereby ruining any chance he had of enjoying those fruits? If that was his old self, then it was good riddance. It was time for a change, and he had gotten one. He noticed how much bigger his veins looked in his arms as well. They were that way in his legs, too. He stared at them until he almost saw them in extreme focus. No one else might have noticed, even if he asked them to look for it, but he could swear he could see them pulsing slightly with every beat of his pounding heart. He wondered how much his jugular was noticeably throbbing. That was an area that he had always noticed on people in movies that were supposed to be dead. No matter how well they held their breath and glazed their eyes over, that pulsing in the neck always revealed that they were merely playing dead. The blood and oxygen surging through his veins was filling him with energy. He was beginning to feel antsy. He did not want to sit any longer. He drummed his palms on his kneecaps and got up. He was no longer dizzy. He felt good. He felt strong. He stretched, but his muscles were tight and aching, as if he had been through a rigorous workout. In a way, he had. He looked around for something to do with that energy. On the ground near his bare foot was the fossilized stick that tapered to a point the size of an index finger. He picked it up and grabbed it in both hands. He began to apply pressure. Its stony texture dug into his palms, but it did not show any signs of bending. He increased the pressure until he felt it maximize. His body shook from the effort, but the stick showed no signs of yielding. He waited for it to suddenly just snap. It had to at any moment. He felt such strength. He sighed and gave up. The stick remained in one piece. He dropped it back into the dirt and watched the plume of dust billow up around it. A stick defeated him. Maybe he was not as strong as he felt. He noticed a feeling of pins and needles dancing under his skin. It began small and gradually increased until a salt and peppery feeling joined in. It almost felt like his skin was burning. He had never had his entire body go to sleep on him before. It was an awful sensation. Even his head had the feeling. It was itching under his scalp. The lightheaded feeling came back. He collapsed on the ground, stirring up a very large dust plume. As the cloud went through the dappled sunlight and past the clearing on into the forest, it intensified and solidified the shafts of light coming through the leaves. Rob noticed that, even in his very uncomfortable state. His discomfort increased further until it was downright agony. He began to wonder if the feeling would ever end when suddenly he vomited all over the ground in front of him. He hadn't even felt it coming. Suddenly it was all out of him and spreading in a yellowish puddle. The stench of bile made him continue to heave unconstructively. He felt some chunks in his sinuses, and he snorted them to get them into his throat, where he could get rid of them by swallowing them back down or hacking them up. That made him heave more. The tiny chunks splattered into the puddle. He took several deep breaths, trying to calm his cramping stomach. It lurched a few more times while he fought the urge. Slowly he got himself under control. His belly relaxed, and his breathing regulated. Even his heart seemed to be slowing its frantic rhythm. He sat back, slack-jawed and tired, looking up at the bright blue sky. It was such a pretty day for all that shitting and vomiting to be occurring on. He closed his eyes and regained himself. He would be okay. He felt steady. He did not feel quite as good as he did before, but at least he felt more relaxed. He looked at the suitcase again. There were plenty of munchies in there. He still had no appetite for them. He was thirsty, though. He went over to the tall water bottle and yanked it up and squirted a mouthful and swallowed it. It soothed and cooled his throat, despite the fact that it had been sitting in the hot sun. He began to feel stuffy, like he wanted to sweat but couldn't. He thought to himself that it must be a dry heat. He dragged the suitcase and the water over to the fallen, petrified trunk of the tree that was outlining almost half the edge of the clearing and curling with it. The sun was more to the west by that point in the day, and there was shade on that side. Just how far past noon it was, Rob didn't know. He climbed up onto one of the colossal broken vertebrates. It had only been out of direct sunlight for a little while, but it felt cool underneath his naked flesh. He brought the water bottle up with him and drank damn near the whole thing. He relaxed up there, recharging for some time, until another side effect began to hit him. His vision was getting blurry again, but not like before. It was not swimming. He was not dizzy, but there was a headache coming on. He squeezed his eyes closed and reopened them. His vision was still fucked up. He closed his eyes again and waited longer for them to correct themselves. They did not. He tried again. What else could he do? He opened his eyes again to see if things were clearing. They were not. He could see everything around him, but he could see something else, too. His own sight was overlapped with a vision of the forest, of tracking through it. It was the same forest. There was no mistaking those gargantuan fossilized remains of what must have once been an elephantine forest, including the creatures that must have once inhabited it. Rob steadied his head movement to minimize his own sight's shakiness. When he closed his eyes, he saw nothing but the insides of his eyelids, so he kept them open and tried the stationary tactic instead. He focused on what the other sight was seeing. His headache was progressing, and there was a faint, high-pitched humming in his ears. He ignored it and only gave his attention to the alternate vision. It was placed over his own sight equally. The view was evenly half his and half something else. He began to hear breaking twigs on the ground and foliage being ruffled as something was making its way through it. He was hearing it with his own ears. That sense was still his own. He could sense something approaching, too. That sense was certainly and entirely still his own. He did not try to look to see what was coming. That would only disorientate him more. He knew exactly where he was and what he could see with his own eyes. That was what he was ignoring. It was right in front of him,